When my husband tried to take half of everything I worked for, I didn't fall apart. I didn't beg. Instead, I handed the judge an envelope that changed everything. And when the judge laughed in his face, I knew justice had finally arrived. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the day the papers arrived. A thick envelope, hand-delivered, with his name scrawled across the return address. For a moment, I thought it was some minor formality, maybe the last bit of bureaucracy to finalize our separation. But when I opened it and saw the words in bold print, his demand for half of my fortune, my hands went cold. Half. Not a portion. Not something reasonable. Half of everything I had spent years building with my own two hands. Businesses I started long before he entered my life. Late nights working alone. Weekends sacrificed. The kind of effort he had always mocked me for. And now, he wanted to cut it neatly in two, as though my blood and sweat were his entitlement by default. I sat at the kitchen table with those papers spread out, my coffee going cold beside me, staring at the numbers his lawyer had written. His claim was bold, almost arrogant, as if victory was already his. I could hear his smug voice in my head. It's marital property. That's the law. You can't stop me. And that's when the anger shifted into something sharper. Determination. You see, I've always been someone who values fairness. When I married him, I thought we'd share a life together, each of us pulling our weight, supporting each other through the hard parts. That's what marriage meant to me. But he had a different definition. To him, it meant taking comfort in the life I built while giving nothing in return. And now, as if mocking me one last time, he was trying to turn the law into a weapon against me. I wasn't going to let him. The more I looked at those papers, the calmer I became. Instead of panicking, I began to feel an almost icy clarity. He thought he was clever, that I would crumble under the pressure. But what he didn't realize was that I had always kept records, always planned ahead. And he had underestimated me for the last time. That was the moment I decided. This wasn't going to be a story of me being robbed or humiliated. This was going to be the story of how he tried to take everything from me and how I made sure he walked away with nothing. Before I tell you how things unraveled, you need to understand the world we lived in and the roles we each played. Because on the surface, to outsiders at least, we looked like any ordinary couple. Too many of our friends, we even seemed happy. But behind closed doors, the reality was far different. I was 34 when I met him. By then, I was already running a modest but promising business. I had worked for years to build it up from nothing. I didn't come from wealth. Every step forward was something I had fought for tooth and nail. I was proud of what I had accomplished, not because I was rolling in money, but because I had carved out a space in the world that was mine. Independence, security, and dignity, that was what my work gave me. He entered my life like a gust of wind. Charming, confident, with that easy smile that could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. At first, I thought his attention was flattering. He made me laugh. He told me I worked too hard, and in those early days, it felt good to have someone who wanted to take care of me, someone who reminded me to slow down, to enjoy life. But slowly, the charm started to peel back. His jokes about my long hours turned sharper. "You'd rather be married to your business," he would mutter when I stayed late at the office. Or, "What's the point of making all that money if you never spend time with me?" At first, I brushed it off. thinking he just wanted more of my attention. But over time, I began to realize it wasn't about love or companionship, it was about resentment. He hated that I was successful. He hated that my achievements cast a shadow over his lack of ambition. The truth was, he never really had any goals of his own. He floated from one job to another, always with excuses about why it wasn't the right fit, why the boss didn't appreciate him, why he was meant for more. Meanwhile, he was perfectly content living in the comfort of the life I provided. Vacations, dinners out, a nice home, things he enjoyed but never contributed to. The warning signs were there. I remember one evening in particular, when we were out with friends. Someone asked how my business was doing, and before I could answer, he cut in with a smug grin. "Oh, you know, we're doing really well. Couldn't do it without me." There was laughter round the table, but I felt my stomach tighten. He hadn't lifted a finger to help me build my business. He never sat with me through the sleepless nights of planning, never risked his savings, never sacrificed his weekends. And yet, he claimed my success as his own, as if by virtue of being my husband, he automatically deserved the credit. I should have seen it then, the entitlement creeping in. But love has a way of blurring your vision. You tell yourself that it's just a quirk, that everyone has flaws, that maybe he'll grow out of it. You excuse things you shouldn't, because you want the picture in your head, the marriage, the partnership, the future to stay intact. But his entitlement only grew stronger. When bills came, he acted as though they were my responsibility. When we discussed the future, he talked about what we would do with our money. But somehow, the we always meant me providing and him enjoying. And then, the turning point came when my business really started to take off. Contracts were signed, revenue doubled, opportunities blossomed. I was proud, yes, but instead of celebrating with me, he grew cold. He would make snide remarks, little jabs about how I was too busy playing CEO to be a wife. Sometimes, I caught him staring at me with something that looked less like love and more like envy. Looking back now, I realize he had already started calculating. The man who once told me I worked too hard was quietly watching, waiting, and plotting how he could turn my success into his payday. At the time, though, I was still blind to the full picture. I thought we were just hitting a rough patch, that marriage required patience and compromise. I didn't realize I was setting the stage for the betrayal that would soon come, the moment when he decided that half of my fortune should rightfully be his. The day it happened began like any other. I was in my office, sipping coffee, scanning through emails, when my assistant walked in with a puzzled look on her face. She handed me an envelope that had just been delivered. Heavy, official looking, with the kind of weight that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. I slid it open, and the first words that jumped out were petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. My breath caught, but I wasn't surprised. By then, our marriage had become a cold shadow of what it once was. He spent his days sulking around the house, or disappearing for hours with vague excuses. Conversations had turned into arguments, and affection had long since vanished. A divorce wasn't unthinkable. What stunned me wasn't that he wanted out, it was what he wanted to take with him. As I read further, my hands began to tremble, not from sadness, but from a rising, burning disbelief. His lawyer had drawn up a demand for half of all marital assets, with a special emphasis on the valuation of my business. He claimed entitlement to 50% of the company I had founded, nurtured, and grown long before I ever met him. I couldn't even finish the first page before I had to put it down and steady myself. The audacity was staggering. He absolutely knew that he had never contributed a dime to the business. He had mocked me for the long nights, sneered at my ambition, and treated my success as an inconvenience. Yet here it was, in black and white, his demand for a fortune he never earned. Later that evening, he came by to talk. He didn't look sheepish or guilty. He walked in with that smug half-smile, as if this was just business as usual. "You had to see this coming," he said, leaning against the doorway like a man who thought he was in control. "It's the law. We were married. Half of what's yours is mine." I stared at him, my voice calm but clipped. "Half? You've never put in a single hour of work. You didn't help build this." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The judge won't care about that. You'll have to give me my share." The arrogance in his tone, the absolute certainty that he could take from me without consequence, it cut deeper than the divorce itself. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. He didn't see me as a partner, or even as a person anymore. I was just a bank account he thought he could drain. In that moment, something inside me hardened. I realized the man I had once loved had crossed a line he could never come back from. Filing for divorce was one thing, we could have parted ways with dignity. But demanding half of my life's work, parading it around as though it were his birthright, that was unforgivable. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked at him and said quietly, "If you think this will be easy, you're in for a surprise." Because right then, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him steal from me. I wasn't going to let him win. If he wanted to fight, he was about to learn that I was far more prepared for this battle than he ever imagined. Asterisk. Once the divorce papers were filed, I naively thought he might back down after seeing how absurd his demands looked on paper. But if anything, he doubled down. It started with whispers. I heard from a mutual friend that he'd been bragging in bars about how he was about to cash out. He painted himself as the clever husband who had played the long game, marrying a successful woman so he could live comfortably and then walk away with millions. "He's saying you'll have no choice but to pay him," my friend told me, almost apologetically. "He's already making plans for what he'll buy." And indeed, I soon saw evidence of it myself. Credit card statements revealed a string of extravagant purchases, expensive electronics, luxury watches, designer clothes. He hadn't won a cent yet, but he was already spending money he believed was guaranteed. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. Then came his lawyer, a sharp-tongued man who introduced himself with a smirk and a warning. "We can make this very messy for you. If you fight, we'll drag this out until the legal fees alone bury you. Wouldn't it be easier to settle?" I listened politely, but inside, my resolve only strengthened. I knew intimidation tactics when I saw them. They were betting on me folding quickly, scared of bad press or financial strain. But they underestimated just how stubborn I could be when someone threatened what I had worked for. The weeks that followed felt like living under siege. Letters arrived daily from his lawyer, each one filled with demands, threats, and exaggerated claims about his supposed contributions to my business. According to their version of events, he had been the backbone of the entire operation, providing emotional labor and strategic input. It was laughable, but also infuriating. Meanwhile, he strutted around like a man who had already won. When he came to pick up some belongings, he didn't even bother hiding his glee. He looked around the house, gesturing at the furniture, the art, the appliances. "Half of this is mine," he said casually, as if he were pointing out items on a shopping list. There was something grotesque about his confidence. He truly believed he was untouchable, that the courts would rubber stamp his lies and reward him with wealth he hadn't earned. His arrogance wasn't just about greed anymore, it was about control. He wanted me to feel powerless, to believe there was nothing I could do. But what he didn't realize was that every smug remark, every reckless purchase, every empty threat was only fueling me. Each escalation made me sharper, calmer, more deliberate, because I knew something he didn't. His house of cards was already wobbling. All it would take was one strong gust of truth to send it crashing down, and I was already preparing to deliver that gust. Just when I thought he couldn't sink any lower, he found a way. I was sitting with my attorney one morning, going over the latest set of documents his lawyer had submitted to the court. Most of it was the same tired rhetoric claims about how he had supported me emotionally while I built my company. Inflated numbers meant to suggest he had contributed financially. Even vague accusations that I had somehow hidden assets. But then my attorney paused, squinting at one particular set of papers. He slid them across the table toward me. "You should look at this," he said. It was a series of supposed business records, emails and invoices that painted a picture of my husband as an active participant in my company. According to these documents, he had handled clients, contributed capital, even co-signed contracts. Except none of it was true. At first, I felt disbelief. My brain wanted to reject what I was seeing, because it was so absurd. But as I read line after line of his fabricated involvement, disbelief hardened into anger. Not the fiery, out-of-control kind of anger, but a cold, steady flame. He had forged documents. He wasn't just trying to leech off me anymore, he was attempting to rewrite history, to steal my life's work on paper. I remember gripping the edge of the table, my nails pressing into the wood as I forced myself to stay calm. My attorney shook his head in disgust. "These won't hold up under scrutiny," he said, "but it's a dirty move. He's trying to muddy the waters, make it harder for you." I nodded slowly. My mind was already shifting gears. Up until then, I had been bracing myself for a defense ready to prove that he hadn't earned what he was demanding. But now I saw things differently. This wasn't about defending anymore. This was about taking control. About making sure he didn't just lose, but that he was exposed for the fraud he truly was. That evening, I sat alone in my office long after the sun went down. The house was quiet. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I stared at the forged papers laid out in front of me and felt something shift deep inside. He thought he was clever. He thought he could outsmart me, twist the narrative, and walk away a rich man. But what he didn't realize was that I had something he didn't. Foresight. I had always kept meticulous records, contracts, emails, receipts, because I knew the value of protecting myself. And I had one other thing he seemed to have forgotten. The prenup. Signed, dated, and legally binding. A document he had once brushed off with a laugh, calling it just a formality. He had signed it willingly, never imagining it would come back to haunt him. And now, it was going to be my weapon. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, I felt a surge of calm confidence. The fear and anxiety were gone. In their place was a simple, steady resolve. He wasn't just going to lose. He was going to be humiliated. The breaking point had arrived. And so had my plan. The breaking point had arrived. And so had my plan. After my attorney left that night, I stayed at the kitchen table until the early hours, the house around me silent except for the low whir of the furnace. I spread every scrap of paper I owned into neat piles: contracts, invoices, emails, bank statements, tax returns, anything that could prove the timeline of my business and the reality of who had built My lamp cast a small pool of light over the documents, and as I sorted them, a clarity settled over me that felt almost physical, like someone switching on a spotlight in a dark theater. He'd tried to create a false history on paper. Fine, I would replace his story with the truth. Page by page, the first pile was the obvious one, the company formation documents. I had copies of the original articles of incorporation, signed and notarized, with dates stamped months before we ever met. There were bank records showing the initial seed money came from my personal account, and a small loan I had taken out in my name. There were emails from the earliest days, ones where I corresponded with suppliers at 3 in the morning, where I argued prices and chased down missed deliveries. Those emails smelled faintly of coffee and late nights when I read them. They were a map of the sleepless years. The dates on those messages were my proof. The second pile contained the bigger wins. Contracts with clients, the payment schedules, signed checks. Those contracts had my name, my title, and my signature. There were testimonials from clients who had come to me because of the product I'd built, not because of anyone else. I highlighted the lines that mattered. Dates, signatures, payment amounts. Each highlighted line was a nail in a coffin of the lie he'd tried to bury me in. And then there was the prenup folded into the back of my safe like a relic. I hadn't thought about it in years. When we signed it, it had felt like a small, sensible thing. A practical document to protect the business I'd been building before marriage. He'd signed it lightly, as if it were a minor inconvenience. He never imagined it would be read in a courtroom. I took the prenup out and smoothed the creases. The signatures were there, his and mine, both witnessed and notarized. The language was clear. Separate property remained separate. Marital property was defined, and specific exclusions regarding business assets were spelled out in precise legal terms. It was almost too clean. It was the kind of document you hope never becomes necessary, because the need for it means trust has failed. But it also happened to be the one document that would make his demand for half of my fortune crumble. The next pile was uglier. The emails he'd written to his friends and a handful of messages he'd sent me when he thought no one else would see. There were the off-handed missions moments where he joked about marrying up, or bragged about how easy it would be to live off my earnings. One email stood out. He'd once called my business a cash cow in a message to a friend, laughing about it as if it were a private joke. Another was a string of text messages where he admitted, in no uncertain terms, that he had never actually taken part in the work. Those messages stung. They were the audio of his conscience, recorded in words. I also collected receipts and account statements showing his sudden lavish spending after the divorce papers were filed. Those invoices, luxury watches, tech gadgets, a new motorcycle told a small but important story. He had been counting on a windfall. They would be useful not only to show his recklessness, but to highlight the contrast between his claims of contribution and his actual behavior. Finally, I put together the piece that made the plan feel real. The evidence of his forgery. Remembering the forged business records my attorney had flagged made my hands go cold again. I had copies of the legitimate versions stored across cloud accounts, in multiple formats. My legal team had already begun an audit comparing genuine records with the forgeries. The differences were small, slightly altered dates, inconsistent fonts, a contract number that didn't match our numbering system, but they were differences that a forensic accountant could trace. And trace they would. Once the piles were arranged, I wrote a table of contents. It was a small thing, almost bureaucratic, but it was also strategic. If evidence is organized and presented cleanly, it's much harder to dismiss as noise. I numbered each item and wrote short notes beside them. Incorporation docs, dated the 12th of June 2012. Prenup, signed the 4th of May 2013, notarized. Emails, admissions 2016 to 2019. Forged records, discrepancies noted. That list would be the spine of the envelope I planned to carry into court. Over the next several days, my life became methodical. Mornings were for meetings with my attorney, afternoons for compiling exhibits, and evenings for practicing how I would conduct myself in court. I rehearsed deliberately, over and over. I practiced the part where I would remain calm while his lawyer tried to bait me. I practiced smiling in a way that was unfazed, not triumphant. I practiced describing my business's timeline in clear, unadorned sentences so the judge could follow without getting lost in emotion. One evening, I stood in front of my hallway mirror in the soft light, envelope in hand, and read aloud. Your Honor, I would say, I am prepared to submit these documents. I watched my mouth form the words, felt the steadiness in my voice. It mattered how I delivered it. Theatrics wouldn't serve me. Precision would. Calm would. Truth would. I also worked on the logistics. You don't just walk into a courtroom and hand the judge a sealed envelope, like it's a dramatic prop from a movie. There are rules, clerks, and procedures. My attorney advised me on the proper way to submit exhibits, file them with the court clerk as official evidence, mark them as exhibits, and ensure that opposing counsel received copies in advance where required. But I wanted the judge to see the envelope in a way that carried impact. So we drafted a motion to admit the documents as evidence and arrange for a short procedural hearing where I could present my case clearly and succinctly. The envelope would be real sealed, marked, and delivered into the court record, but I would also make the judge pause by presenting the prenup and the smoking gun emails in that moment. In plain sight, there was one more psychological element to the plan. I wanted the contrast to be undeniable. When my husband swaggered into court with his lawyer and his bravado, I wanted the judge and everyone in the room to see the mismatch between his performance and the facts. The envelope wasn't meant to humiliate for humiliation's sake. It was meant to make the truth look so clean, so incontrovertible, that his lies would feel ridiculous by comparison. I wanted the humor of it, the way arrogance often looks absurd when it's stripped of its pretense. So I packed the envelope that night, not carelessly, but with the quiet ceremony of someone closing a chapter. Inside it went the prenup on top, the incorporation documents underneath, the highlighted contracts and correspondence, copies of the forged documents beside the originals, and a clear, typed index at the front. I did not write anything scathing across the outside. I didn't need to. I sealed it and placed it in a folder labeled Exhibit A for court. I made more copies, one for the court clerk, one for my attorney because practicalities mattered. When I finally closed the door to my office and leaned against it, there was a small, private laugh that escaped me. It wasn't cruelty. It was relief. For weeks I had been reacting responsive, defensive, tired. Now I was acting. The prenatal documents and emails weren't just paper. They were the legal equivalent of a mirror that would force him to look at himself and at the story he had been telling. I slept that night with my hands clenched in a way I hadn't in months, not from fear, but from readiness. I knew that the fight ahead would not be easy. He still had lawyers, and he still had the ability to lie and delay. But I also knew something even more important. When truth is organized and presented without flourish, it has a way of moving people. And when arrogance meets that kind of truth, clean, inevitable, and well documented, the result is often more devastating than any dramatic confrontation. My unique weapon was not a trap or a twist of fate. It was the documents I had always kept. The careful record-keeping I had done not out of paranoia but out of professionalism, and the simple act of choosing to use them at the right moment. The envelope wasn't a theatrical prop. It was the crystallization of years of work, vigilance, and quiet foresight. And with that, the plan was no longer a plan. It was a course of action. I was ready to move, and I knew exactly how I would do it. I was ready to move, and I knew exactly how I would do it. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt smaller than I remembered, less intimidating, almost domestic. The marble floors were scrubbed clean, the air smelled faintly of coffee, and sunlight cut across the waiting room like a pale ribbon. I arrived early, not because I needed time to calm my nerves but because I wanted to watch the scene assemble. He arrived later with that same swagger I had once mistaken for confidence, flanked by his lawyer who kept checking his watch as if time itself were an ally. I walked in with my attorney beside me, a quiet, steady presence. My envelope, really was tucked under my arm like a talisman. Courtroom procedures are oddly ritualistic. We signed in. The bailiff called the case. There was a soft rustle as people settled into benches and shuffled papers. To most of the room, this was just another family law matter. To me, it was everything. When the judge entered, he carried with him that calm authority that makes people speak more carefully. He was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a voice that made you slow down when you listened. As he sat, the room quieted. Arguments were made. Motions were filed, the usual dance of legal formalities. My attorney moved efficiently through the procedural steps we'd rehearsed. A brief statement of purpose, the filing of the motion to admit exhibits, a request for judicial notice of specific documents. I watched him, took cues from his pauses, and felt the old nervousness, only now it was tempered by certainty. Opposing counsel objected to the suddenness of the evidence, tried to paint it as a surprise tactic. His voice was surly with disdain. "Your Honor," he said, "we received informal materials only days ago. This is procedurally improper." He wanted to make my presentation look like a stunt. He wanted the judge to see me as theatrical, emotional, and therefore unreliable. I could have let my attorney handle it entirely. That was the safer route. But we had planned for this moment, down to the way I would speak. I stood when my attorney signaled and walked to the podium, with the measured pace of someone delivering a prepared statement. The room was quieter than I expected. I could hear the soft hum of the heating vents and the faint flip of the pages. As someone checked a file, my hands were not shaking. I set the folder down, slid the sealed envelope toward the clerk, and looked up at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, voice steady and even, "I submit Exhibit A for the court's consideration. These documents establish the formation and timeline of my business, demonstrate the fraudulent alterations submitted by the opposing party, and include a prenuptial agreement that directly addresses the ownership of the company in question. There is a strange intimacy to stating the truth in a place designed for it. Words sit differently in a courtroom. They are small, precise tools that can cut or heal depending on how they are used." I watched as the clerk marked the envelope, stamped it with the court's seal, and logged it into the record. It felt deliberate, ceremonial in a way that removed drama and left only the facts. The first step was administrative. Admit the documents into evidence. The judge read the cover sheet aloud, the dates and descriptions rolling out in clinical cadence. There was a silence. Then the opposing counsel began his cross-examination, attempting to poke holes in the chain of custody, the timing of submission, any tiny procedural misstep he could find. He was fishing for reason to call my credibility into question. That's when my preparation paid off. Before I ever arrived, my attorney had secured sworn affidavits from a forensic accountant and the notary, who had witnessed the prenup signing. He had certified copies of bank statements and timestamps from server logs, proving the original email's dates. He had also subpoenaed metadata from our email host to demonstrate the authenticity of the correspondence. None of this was flashy. It was meticulous, boring work, the kind of work that wins cases because it leaves no room for plausible doubt. We called the forensic accountant first. He explained, in plain language, how the opposing documents had been altered, mismatched fonts, dates that didn't align with server timestamps, and contract numbers that didn't fit our established numbering system. He produced side-by-side comparisons. It was painfully technical, but the gist was simple and devastating. Those records were fabricated. As he spoke, I watched my husband. His face, which had been set in a confident mask that morning, began to pale. He shifted in his seat like someone realizing the floor beneath them might be less solid than they thought. His lawyer scribbled notes, then clenched his jaw. For the first time since this began, I noticed a look in my husband's eyes that I had seen only once before, when the projects I had poured myself into were delayed by a supplier problem, and he'd felt the sting of helplessness. Panic is a small, intimate emotion. It makes people oddly human. After the accountant, my attorney presented the prenup. He recited the clause that mattered most, a clear delineation that assets brought into the marriage remained the separate property of the person who owned them, unless otherwise specified. He read the signature block, the notary's stamp, the witness attestations. The simplicity of the document's language had a mean elegance to it. It said nothing dramatic, only the law. But in that simplicity lay its power. Opposing counsel tried to argue technicalities. He challenged the relevance of certain emails and attempted to reframe offhand text messages as banter. He objected to the admission of the credit card receipts that showed my husband's post-filing extravagance as prejudicial. The judge listened with that same careful attention he'd shown from the start. He asked a few measured questions, not in the way of someone searching for drama, but as someone making sure the record was complete. Then came the moment we had been building toward. My attorney asked for permission to read aloud a short selection of messages, those candid admissions my husband had sent to friends. The ones where he referred to my business as a cash cow and joked about marrying up. The judge permitted it. Hearing those words in a room full of people, spoken out of the private context into the public record, had a peculiar weight. They didn't need rhetorical flourish. Their meaning was self-evident. I felt it then, the shift in the air. People look at the obvious differently when someone else reads it aloud in an official setting. It removes plausible deniability. The words were the same ones he'd typed in casual arrogance, but now, labeled as evidence, they were a confession. Opposing counsel's attempts to minimize things began to sound frantic. He rambled about motive and mischaracterization, but the narrative he'd been trying to create of a spouse wronged by a harsh and unyielding partner was cracking beneath the weight of organized facts. My husband looked terrible. He muttered under his breath. He tried to catch my eye once, a pleading glance that I did not return. When the clerk finished reading the cover sheet and the exhibits were fully in the record, there was a momentary hush. The judge leaned back and steepled his fingers. He had the documents before him. He had read the accountant's report. He had listened to the excerpted emails and examined the prenup. He was quiet, a long, deliberate moment, long enough to make everyone in the room feel the pause. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, addressing my husband by the name he used in the filing, Are you aware that these documents include a notarized prenuptial agreement signed by you? There was no malice in the question, only the neutral curiosity of someone tasked with determining fact from fiction. My husband's mouth moved, but no sound came out for a beat. Then he said, with a thin defensiveness, "Yes, Your Honor, I signed years ago, but it was," he stammered, searching for a legal escape hatch. The moment wasn't over. The judge continued, eyes flicking between the documents and the man who had filed the petition. "And do you deny that these emails and the forensic report show discrepancies in the records you submitted?" The judge's voice was steady, almost bemused. He was setting the scene. He was letting the facts speak until they made their own judgment obvious. That was where I let my silence work for me. I didn't gloat. I didn't rush to celebrate. Instead, I sat still, held my hands in my lap, and watched the unfolding. I had done what needed to be done. I had presented truth in an orderly way. And now it was the court's responsibility to respond. The judge's next words came with a thin, incredulous smile, and even before he spoke, I felt the room lean in, waiting for the pivot that would move the whole story toward its next act. The judge's smile was subtle at first, the kind you might mistake for a private thought. But then, as he tapped the edge of the prenup with his pen, it broke into something unmistakable. Amusement. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice calm but tinged with disbelief. "You do understand what you've submitted here, don't you? These supposed business records contradict not only themselves, but your own signed prenuptial agreement. Quite an unusual strategy, I must say." The courtroom chuckled softly. Even the clerk smirked as she shuffled papers back into order. My attorney remained perfectly composed, but I could feel his satisfaction radiating beside me. My husband, on the other hand, flushed crimson. He leaned forward in his chair, hands gripping the table, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. "Your Honor, with respect, I was misled. I didn't understand." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "No, Mr. Thompson, what you've done here is clear. You've presented fabricated evidence to this court, and you've wasted everyone's time in the process. I don't take kindly to either." The smirk on his lawyer's face had long since disappeared. He scribbled furiously in his notes, then whispered something to my husband. But it was too late. The damage was already done. I watched him unravel. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by a twitch in his jaw, his eyes darting around as though searching for an escape hatch. For months, he had strutted like a man certain of victory, parading around as though half my fortune were already in his pocket. And now, in the space of a few minutes, the rug had been yanked out from under him. The judge shook his head slowly, almost pityingly, before continuing. "This court will not entertain fraudulent claims. The prenuptial agreement is clear. The business in question, along with all related assets, remains the sole property of the petitioner." He turned his gaze toward me briefly, giving the faintest nod of acknowledgement, before returning his focus to my husband. "As for you, Mr. Thompson, I strongly suggest you reconsider the path you've chosen. Fabricating evidence is not just unethical, it borders on criminal. You may find yourself facing more consequences than you anticipated." The silence that followed was deafening. My husband's mouth opened as if to argue, but his lawyer's hand shot out, gripping his arm firmly. He shook his head, silently warning him not to dig the hole any deeper. It was a delicious irony. The man who had accused me of selfishness, who had painted himself as the victim of a cold and calculating wife, was now exposed as exactly what he was: a greedy, careless fraud. And the best part, his own arrogance had done it. He had been so sure of his lies, so convinced that I would crumble under pressure, that he never stopped to think about how easily the truth could slice through them. I sat there in silence, composed, letting the moment linger, watching his downfall play out before a judge, with witnesses and court staff all bearing witness, was more satisfying than any shouting match could have ever been. He had wanted an audience for his supposed triumph. Instead, he got one for his humiliation. Asterisk. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on my husband, and gave a short, incredulous laugh. It wasn't cruel, but it cut deeper than any scolding could. That laugh said everything. You thought you were clever, and now the entire courtroom sees how foolish you really are. I've presided over many divorce cases, the judge said, still shaking his head. But I must admit, this one stands out. 2 present falsified documents in an attempt to seize assets clearly protected by a prenuptial agreement. Mr. Thompson, did you think this court wouldn't notice? A ripple of laughter swept through the courtroom benches. Even the bailiff smirked, quickly hiding it behind a cough. My husband sat rigid, his face flushed a blotchy red, his mouth opening and closing like a man gasping for air. His lawyer pressed a hand over his brow, clearly wishing he could vanish into the floor. The judge's tone hardened then. Let the record show. The petitioner's evidence is admitted. The prenuptial agreement is binding. Mr. Thompson's claims are dismissed in their entirety. Furthermore, given the submission of fraudulent documents, the court orders that Mr. Thompson be liable for the petitioner's attorney fees. It was like the final domino tipping. In a single ruling, every lie, every arrogant threat, every smug grin collapsed. Instead of walking away with half my fortune, he was walking out deeper in debt than when he began. The room buzzed with energy. I caught the glance of the clerk, who gave me a small, approving nod. My attorney sat back, calm as ever, but I could see the flicker of triumph in his eyes. My husband, meanwhile, sank into his chair, his lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. He didn't speak, couldn't speak. For months, he had built his life around the fantasy of victory, and now, in the span of minutes, it was gone, burned away by a single envelope and the truth it carried. I felt no need to gloat, no urge to say a word. His humiliation was complete without me lifting a finger. The judge's laugh, the dismissal, the order to pay my fees, that was the justice. That was the moment the scales balanced, as the bailiff called the next case. I gathered my things with deliberate calm. I didn't even look at him as I walked out. He had wanted me broken, begging. Instead, I left the courtroom taller than I had walked in, while he sat there crumbling under the weight of his own downfall. For the first time in months, I breathed freely. Justice wasn't just served, it was served with irony. He had tried to steal my fortune, and instead, he ended up financing my victory. Asterisk. Walking out of that courtroom, the sun felt warmer than it had in months. The weight I'd been carrying, the stress, the sleepless nights, the fear that somehow justice might slip away was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady relief. The ruling was clear. My fortune, my business, and my independence remained mine. More than that, the judge had ordered him to cover my attorney's fees. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had tried to drain me financially had ended up footing the bill for the very defense. That destroyed him. In the weeks that followed, his bravado evaporated. Word spread quickly among our circle of friends and acquaintances. People who had once humored his arrogance now looked at him with thinly veiled pity, or worse, disdain. He wasn't the clever husband who had outmaneuvered his successful wife. He was the fool who had been laughed out of court for forging documents. Financially, the blow hit him hard. With his debts piling up and his reputation in tatters, The luxuries he had once flaunted disappeared. The expensive watch sold. The designer clothes pawned. The man who had strutted around like he owned half my world now struggled to keep his own afloat. For me, life settled into something far more peaceful. My company thrived, unburdened by his interference. The home that had once echoed with tension became a sanctuary again. Evenings were filled with quiet dinners, laughter with friends, and the simple joy of knowing I was free from his shadow. Looking back, the moral was as sharp and undeniable as the judge's laughter that day. Greed blinds, and arrogance destroys. He hadn't just lost because of the prenup or the forged papers. He lost because he underestimated me, because he believed his lies were stronger than my truth. And as for me, I learned that sometimes justice doesn't come in loud, dramatic bursts. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a quiet envelope, a knowing smile from a judge, and the sound of a man realizing, too late, that his empire was made of sand. My new normal wasn't just about reclaiming my fortune. It was about reclaiming myself, my peace, my dignity, my future. And that, more than anything, was the sweetest justice of all. Asterisk.